A lot of you seem to be worried mainly about the species that are traded. And of course, I'm also worried about that, but also I'm worried about where could they be introduced in non-native ranges and what would their effects be on our native biodiversity. And one of these things, of course, contributing to alien species and biological invasions is the pet trade. And some of you have mentioned that in previous talks and in previous weeks. I'm just going to present some work of some of my students here, Kevin and Takalani, that worked on tarantulas and other invertebrates. So the pet trade is dominated by vertebrates, I would say, and it's a lot of ornamental fish that are traded globally, a lot of birds, reptiles, and relatively fewer mammals. And of course, some of these pets have become problematic where they were introduced, and that can be due to accidental escapes or due to deliberate releases. If people don't want their pets anymore, the pets grow too big, or the children don't want them anymore, and then they get released into the wild because people think that's the right thing to do. And some of these really cause big problems where that happens. And one of the most well-known examples probably is the cat. Cats have caused many extinctions of native species, mainly on islands, but they are a problem basically wherever they are introduced as vicious predators. Another very well-known example is the Burmese python, which has been introduced in the Everglades in Florida, and it's caused havoc on the native biodiversity. And then this fish in the corner down here is a goldfish that we probably know much more from little bowls. And of course, they can grow much bigger when they are introduced into the wild, and they have also caused huge problems in some introduced lakes and rivers. But it's not always the species themselves or the pets themselves that actually cause the direct problems. Sometimes they also introduce other species with them, or diseases, for example. Amphibians have been traded a lot also as pets, and some of them have contributed to the spread of the chytrid fungus, which is causing a global decline of lots of amphibian species. So yeah, lots of problems that could be related to the pet trade. In South Africa, we have recently also looked at that as part of a book chapter on pathways of introduction and how these species get introduced and dispersed into South Africa. And this is a huge book. I don't know if you can see my video, but it's very huge and heavy. If you're interested, it's also available online for free. And it basically tells you pretty much everything we know about biological invasions in South Africa. But in this graph, you can see the number of introduced taxa from the pet trade over time. And you see the numbers are generally very low. They are increasing, but very few pet species have actually become established in the wild in South Africa. And if we compare that with general number of introduced taxa using different pathways, you see that these numbers are much higher. So really the pet trade doesn't seem to be so important in South Africa. But also maybe that's just because we haven't looked properly. So one of my students looked at tarantulas in the pet trade. Of course, there have been studies on more well-known or less neglected taxa, but I'm not going to talk about them here because we are talking about neglected taxa here. So yeah, tarantulas. He looked at the species offered online in physical pet stores, and he did a survey with hobbyists and looked at expositions. And of course, you can see that online we find the most species advertised. And I think a lot of previous talks have also shown that really the internet is the main problem here. That's what we have to look at. And with pet stores, we often ended up finding the same species again and again, even if we went to more shops. We found 195 species advertised, and 35 of those were not recognized species. So we couldn't actually pinpoint them to specific species. Then Takalani, another student of mine, he looked at other alien terrestrial invertebrates. So he excluded tarantulas from this. But he found about 100 species advertised. Some of them were actually also native to South Africa, but 36 of them were alien species. And 39 of them, again, were not recognized. And the same picture here, you see that the online trade was the most important, contributing more and more species every time we looked at a different web page. But what we are really interested in here is what are the risks of these species being traded in the pet trade? Could they survive and establish outside of captivity, for example? Or would they cause harm to biodiversity and human well-being? What are their actual and potential impacts? And this is actually my main area of research. You might have heard that in Carol's introduction. So a lot of risk assessment and risk analysis tools have been developed and frameworks to assess risks, exactly to feed into this decision making on what are the risks and into finding out what should we be doing about these things. And I'd love to talk to you more about this. There's no time for that, but I'm just gonna add a little advertisement on this new standard that has just been adopted by the IUCN, which is the environmental impact classification for alien taxa, which enables us to compare impacts of alien taxa between each other, between areas. And if you're interested to hear more, you can either ask me or find it online. But there's also other things besides impact that contribute to the risk of invasion. And often we have seen that if a species is invasive elsewhere, it's also likely to be invasive in a new range. So we've looked at tarantulas, have they been invasive anywhere else? And there's only one species, which is the Mexican redrum, which has been introduced elsewhere and actually established populations outside of its native range. But tarantulas don't seem to be generally problematic where they're introduced. How about our other terrestrial invertebrates? So first of all, we looked at the climate suitability. How much of South Africa's area is actually climatically suitable for the species that we found in the trade? And then we also looked at how many times were they offered. So how many times did we find them for sale, which is the availability index that you see here on the x-axis. And we did not find any species which had a high availability index and a high proportion of suitable climate. So that shows us that probably the risk of them to be found outside of captivity and to establish is rather low. And just to show you how these crudely, these climate maps look like. So this shows you the suitable climate for one of these cockroaches that was available. And yeah, that's the one that was also had a little bit of a higher availability index. Also, Takalani also looked at impacts, and there was not a lot of information available for these species where they were introduced. So unfortunately, that's also a problem of neglected taxa, is that there's often less data available on things that would feed into these impact and risk assessments. So if we look at taxa available for the invertebrates other than tarantulas, most of them were insects. And then there were lots of arachnids other than tarantulas, for example, scorpions, and then a few other groups which were very underrepresented. But again, you can see the gray areas show you a lot of those species were unconfirmed. We couldn't pinpoint them to any recognized species name. And that is, of course, a big problem if we want to know what the risks are of these species. So general issues with the pet trade, I think they also have been mentioned before, is that many trade names did not match any recognized species names. So we don't know what we're dealing with. And then also, we bought some species and actually did some DNA barcoding to see if they were identified correctly. And lots of the species which had proper names or which you could match to species names, they were misidentified. So again, there's a lot of a lot of gaps with regards to the knowledge on the species names. So it's really difficult to know what we have in the trade and what we have in the country. And it's impossible to assess the risk if we don't know what species we're dealing with, because a lot of the data that we would feed into these assessments, they are based on the species. So what is the species distribution? What are its life history traits? And all these things we cannot know if we don't know the species. And again, that is especially problematic for neglected groups because generally they are less well known, taxonomies may be less well studied and things like that. So I found that, well, I was very interested to be involved in this symposium. And I think this talk is actually, or this topic is very fitting because all the species traded could also be alien somewhere where they are introduced. And then, of course, we might have to worry about what do they do where they are alien. And we need to understand what is traded in order to understand what are the risks to the recipient environments as well. So which species are traded, all the same questions that you're basically asking when you want to protect the species that's traded, we also need to know if we want to protect the recipient environment. So what are they traded for? What is the trade volume? From where to where are they moving and things like that. So yeah, it's been very interesting and I'm very happy that I was involved in the symposium and that my student couldn't make it because he was actually first invited to come. Just another thing is that, of course, there's also other uses other than pet trade for these understudied groups or neglected groups when it comes to invasions. And we actually did a little study a few years ago just to brainstorm what are these invertebrates used for. Of course, a lot of invertebrates, for example, are introduced unintentionally, but there's also intentional trade like pet trade. And we found so many different uses and all of those involve different species and all of those involve different risks. So some are introduced for cultural practices, medicinal use, dye production, bioweapons, and I'm sure you could add a lot of those uses to this list. And I'd be very keen to hear if you have anything to add to this list. But yeah, all of these come with different risks and there's still lots to do. Thank you very much, Carol, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for listening. And this is my email address. Please email me if you want to talk. Thank you.